of papers and books they've written is even much more than 100. So.
Okay. So, hello everyone. My name is Daniela Ozacky Stern, and I am so honored to open this virtual event organized by the Holocaust Studies program at Western Galilee College in Akko, Israel. In recent years, new studies on photographs relating to the Holocaust have expanded and resulted in innovative scholarly works. We are honored to have with us today 3 of the leading scholars of the field, Dr. Ofer Ashkenazi, Professor Jürgen Matthäus, and Professor Wendy, whose research shed new light and contribute to our better understanding of the period. In one of my classes at the Western Galilee College, we discussed in length about the events in the Warsaw Ghetto. And as I showed several photographs, one of my students suddenly said, "I had no idea that the ghetto looked like that. I had a whole different image of it in my mind." Photographs are crucial to both us scholars and for our students. When we first published the program of today's event, we were amazed to see how much interest it arose. So we are looking forward to having an inspiring discussion on the topic, photography as witnessing. Our moderator for today will be Jan Burzlaff, a William Aikman Fellow for Holocaust Studies at Harvard University and former fellow at Princeton University. Jan has published on pogroms and communal violence, visual history, and social relations during the Holocaust. His dissertation deals with transnational history of Jewish survival during the Holocaust. His essay on photography was published in Yad Vashem Studies just weeks ago. But first, let me introduce to you Dr. Ofer Ashkenazi. Dr. Ashkenazi is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Kobner Minerva Center for German History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His recent publications include the monograph Anti-Heimat Cinema, the Jewish Invention of the German Landscape, published at the University of Michigan in 2020. His current project considers Jewish photographs under Nazism. Some technical notes: we are recording the session and we'll upload it to our website, and please keep your microphone on mute. If you have any questions for our panelists, please write them down on the chat. As always, I want to thank Dr. Boaz Cohen, head of the program, Dr. Roni, Mikel, Arieli, who will manage the Q&A, Jan Burzlaff, and Dr. Yaron Pasher from the organizing team. Ofer Ashkenazi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. I was asked to say a few opening remarks to set the stage, so I promise to keep it brief and have the stage for the main event of the evening. I would like to start by saying that this evening, this meeting represents a new awareness to photography among historians of the Holocaust. Until recently, with few notable exceptions, scholars have used photographs merely as illustrations for studies that were based mainly on other sources. In textbooks and in Holocaust museums, photographs normally were presented naively as testimonies of what really happened or how history really looked like. The two speakers that we will hear today demonstrate a novel approach, which seeks to develop methods for photoanalysis, which would explore and highlight aspects that have been hitherto overlooked or marginalized. This turn to photography is crucial for the study of the Holocaust. By the early 1930s, when the National Socialists assumed power in Germany, millions of Europeans, and Germans in particular, had cameras. Moreover, the relatively cheap and easy to use cameras were held by a photo-literate public. People who were familiar with the aesthetics, iconography, and styles of photography, and even its politics, from reading the extremely popular illustrated magazines, photo books, and photography manuals. As a result, the life under Nazism in Germany and in Eastern Europe, National Socialist atrocities and their victims have been constantly documented on camera. Some scholars estimate that there are millions of Holocaust-related photographs currently available in various archives around the world. Most of them have not been discussed by scholars. It is true that there are only a handful of photographs that documented mass executions, but surprisingly numerous atrocities have been photographed, from forced labor and daily lives in the ghettos to the routines that facilitated mass murder in Auschwitz. These photographs, as you will hear today, are not merely a display of what happened, but they participate in an endeavor to infer the meaning of what happened, to influence the memory of the event, and of the position of the photographers, the photographed people, and the intended viewers vis-a-vis the photographic event. The research and publication of tonight's speakers wonderfully demonstrate what can be deduced from a careful examination of perpetrators' photographs. The particular way participants in atrocities, and sometimes excited onlookers, documented these atrocities reveals how they perceive themselves, their identity and their role in the violent acts and the violent acts themselves. Or at least it reveals their endeavor to be remembered in a particular way. To be clear, like people gestures, taste, and speech, the compositions of photographs do not necessarily exhibit a conscious effort to produce a certain reaction. Yet, familiar with the crucial and social context in which the photographs was taken, historians can reconstruct the effect of the photograph and read it between the lines, so to speak. No less important, victims of photographed atrocities are also part of the photographic event. In certain cases, perpetrators' photographs unwillingly grant victims with notion of subjectivity, agency, and even an opportunity for resistance, mostly resisting to comply with the perpetrator's imagination of the victims as inhumane, passive, or malicious. To this groundbreaking path that the speakers will outline today, we should also add another category, namely atrocity photographs that were taken by victims. Naturally, it is a relatively smaller group of images. Most of them relate to violence in an indirect and coded manner. Oftentimes, documentation of atrocity, including symbols of Jewish exclusion or even possible threats to Jews, risked Jewish photographers. And yet these photographs, first of all, there are a number of them, tens of thousands of them in Germany alone, of photographs that were taken by Jews under the Nazi rules. And there are many more outside of Germany as well. And these photographs are crucial for the understanding of the victims' experiences in the face of Nazism. I would like to share just one image. This photograph was found in the city archive in Bonn by a scholar in the team that works with me on the project that was mentioned before, Dr. Rebecca Grossman, found it as part of a collection of Abraham Ziff, who was a teenager in 1938, 1939, when he took many photographs of Jews in Bonn. And you can see here, forced labor group that works, all of them are Jewish, work in the street. You can see, as I said before, that he could not, it was risky to take a photograph when the guard was there, so he only could go there when the guard was not. However, what we have is a photograph that doesn't show, is a photograph that doesn't show a guard, just the people working, and give us a sense of control of the scene, give us a sense of agency. I'm sorry, someone is speaking with me, and it's, thank you. Give us a sense of agency of the way they want to portray the scene. And you can also see that we see exactly what it is all about, even though we don't have the guard there. You can see the person that stands in the back, look into the ground. There are older people there. There is no joyful atmosphere of work. The sky is gray, and in the background we have this wall that creates the impression of a prison. So the city street in this photograph becomes some kind of a punishing colony or a prison for Jews. And it is important because this photograph is part of a series of photographs that shows us the Nazification of the cityscape, the city of Bonn. Step by step, we see, like here, we see the Hitler Youth marching, and again, he takes it from afar, from an angle that would not risk him taking it. We have many photos that show slowly by slowly how the Jews are pushed out of the street to the side of the street, and then eventually to this
1938
punishing company. So this is from 1939. The other one that I showed was from 1938.
What do you want? Decaf?
So really late.
I'm sorry, we are trying to find the person.
So again, I don't want to get into too many details, and I want to leave the stage for the main speakers of the evening. I just wanted to mention this perspective and to call for a more comprehensive scholarship that will take into account both perpetrators, onlookers, and Jews as the ones who document this reality, these experiences under the Nazi rules in Germany and in Europe. I'm looking forward to the talks. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm taking over. Thank you, Ofer. Work on Holocaust photography is booming. There's no doubt about it. Over the past 2 decades, scholars have laid the foundations for now blossoming visual history that questions reception, context, interpretation, and spectatorship of Holocaust photography. And this has become an ever-growing trend in the field and in the context all the more of public history and massive digitization. As Ofer just said, millions of photographs are held in archives, scattered across the world. He just showed one from the Stadtarchiv Bonn, and even in private collections in homes, attics, and basements. As the organizing team at Western Galilee College, we have collectively decided that it is high time to take stock of what we know and where we go from here. We are lucky enough today to have 2 eminent Holocaust scholars with us who have increasingly shifted themselves towards visual history of the Nazi genocide. Both will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we open the floor to questions from the audience, which has proven a tradition, always very interested and keen on asking questions. First, we have Jürgen Matthäus. Jürgen Matthäus is the Director for Applied Research Scholars at the USHMM in Washington, D.C. He completed his PhD summa cum laude in history at the Ruhr University Bochum in Germany in 1992. And while teaching at universities in the US, Australia, and Germany, he worked as the senior historian for the War Crimes Investigations Unit of the Australian Attorney General's Department, and then for the USHMM in Washington, D.C., where he now directs the Mandel Center's Applied Research Team since 2005. Central to all publications, and I had to limit myself to some of many fascinating studies, include Approaching an Auschwitz Survivor, Holocaust Testimony and Its Transformation, 2009, and the co-editorship of Alfred Rosenberg's Diaries, 2015, Jewish Responses to Persecution, A Source Reader, 2017, and the 2019 Festschrift to Chris Browning, Beyond Ordinary Man. Jürgen is currently working on a project that analyzes German photo albums in occupied Eastern Europe. As the saying goes, the opinions Jürgen is voicing are his. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of the USHMM. Jürgen, very happy to meet you finally. It's an honor, and collectively we're thrilled to have you and eager to hear about your ongoing project. And as the saying goes, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's great to be here. Thank you for the invite. This is almost like extended family. I think the special early bird award goes to my dear friend Conrad Creed, who is zooming in from Sydney, Australia. So this is a topic I'm grappling with. So I see many of the real experts among the audience and other panelists, but I'm still grappling with this one. And so this is pretty much a work in progress. Let me start with a definition that might be necessary here, because the term album is not one that is so easily understood these days. So the dictionary definition, as you can see it here, is really broad. What I mean when I use the term photographic compilations in a book analogous medium. And in this sense, the original meanings of both blank tablet and album of friends seem quite fitting. German albums with photos of World War II come in many shapes and sizes, from clearly labeled war collections to family albums, from elaborate, highly stylized productions to hastily produced displays among fellow soldiers. From albums started, completed, or left unfinished during the war to creations produced or revised after 1945, with all kinds of hybrids between those categories. And then, of course, there is a difference between albums compiled for official use during the war on the one hand, such as the well-known Auschwitz album or the Stroop report on the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and on the other hand, the many more albums with snapshots by German and Austrian men and women made for private purposes, which is my topic today. So this session is about photography as witnessing in conjunction with the Holocaust. So where do German photo albums fit in? For the most part, they don't tell the story we know happened and we thus expect to see. Ofer and Jan just referred to the abundance of visual material that's out there. Well, it doesn't really apply for what I'm working on here, because in the more than 300 albums that I have surveyed, there are very few photographs that show German violence directed against Jews and other civilians in the occupied East. And where such photographs appear, they seem marginalized by the album's other images and by the overall album narrative. While there is some overlap with Nazi-era propaganda imagery produced on a massive scale by Wehrmacht propaganda companies, these albums are different in that they depict what Germans photographed and deemed worth preserving for themselves. Albums offer plenty of analytical conundrums. Among them, there are sometimes cryptic messages, nebulous provenance, and later interventions, for example, in the form of removed images or captions, as you can see here on that slide. In order to analyze the story an album is telling, we need to apply close reading and careful contextualization. Now, this is not possible in the minutes I have left here. At best, I can offer a few glimpses by way of examples. My broader project includes studying single images by trying to explain what is depicted with the help of additional sources. My main focus, however, is on album narratives in order to decipher how war is represented and perceived. In the book I'm preparing, I investigate the album as a storytelling and sense-making device, specifically how German private photo albums depict war in the East and shape perceptions of the Nazi past that frame German crimes in a way that makes them disappear. I will focus here on two aspects related to what I call biased witnessing. First, album narratives and depictions of war, and second, and very briefly, memory and history. So a few words about the production of private photo albums. Since the late 19th century, they were standard tools to depict their owners and their families in spectacular, historically important, or otherwise remarkable settings. That certainly was the case too during the Third Reich, heightened by Germans' awareness, reinforced by the Nazi propaganda drumbeat, that they were living in historic times, none more momentous and visibly intriguing than the Reich's military expansion starting in September 1939. Not only motifs mattered, but the prospective audience too. An album was created to be shown to a smaller or larger circle of people, perhaps to be displayed on a bookshelf or a coffee table. In addition to sequentially arranged photographs, albums often include captions or other forms of written text. An album's format is thus not purely visual. It also has literary, material, and performative qualities that impact how the narrative is told and received. Not unlike the image collations shared today on the internet, an album is a device for affirming a person's sense of self and social connectedness, a means of documenting and communicating. But what about photos of war's violence, the destruction, the dead, even mutilated bodies? At the time, to collect and display such images was not taboo, as exemplified by photo books about previous wars and especially World War I. So despite the scarcity of imagery showing deadly violence against Jews and other civilians, war and its destructive effects figure prominently in most albums. They do so through images of destroyed objects, shelled vehicles, downed planes, ruins of houses, of displaced, often destitute civilians, and of dead creatures, particularly horses. Even if violence is not directly shown, we can read it into an image depending on our knowledge and interest. In post-battle shots, human corpses are also depicted, with photographs of dead enemy soldiers or civilians vastly outnumbering images of dead Germans. Moreover, there is an abundance of imagery showing German soldiers' graves and portraits or group photos marked with indicators of these Germans' death. I will come back to this at the end of my talk. But more frequently, albums look inward, showing seemingly innocent images of military life. Germans, mostly, but not always men, bonding, posing individually or as a group in different settings, sometimes including local or other civilians. These images match the traditional functions of private albums with their prevalence of celebrations, vacations, and status advance visuals, all occasions for happy people to smile into cameras. And there was no situation more happy, if we go by its proliferation in albums, than off-duty celebrations, parties, and other kinds of in-group get-togethers. Despite the massive gender imbalance inherent in military life, these scenes replicate and invoke traditional album topics such as family festivities and outings, and with it, they convey a sense of continuity, order, and meaning in times of massive, unsettling change. And yet, these war images are heavily tilted towards male bonding rituals, visible in frequent depictions of physical activities, role-playing, or festive alcohol consumption. An indication for the blending of official and private spheres are party scenes that show comical dress-up featuring uniform items or other military equipment. In this case, you see on the upper left a supposedly comical rendition of a police arrest at the lodge gate-to-gate, with likely a German policeman acting as the Jewish culprit. Whether or not private albums included violent scenes of war depended to a large degree on their target audience. If it was the circle of military buddies with whom the album author wanted to share his war memories, then battlefield photos, sometimes even including killed German soldiers, appear more frequently. If the prospective audience was the family, however, album authors tended to exclude such photos and instead highlight other, mostly non-bloody aspects of their wartime experience. But this rule of thumb was not clear-cut. We can find plenty of exceptions, and an album author's deployment near or far away from the front line clearly played a role in the frequency of battlefield scenes. Violent or non-violent war scenes are part of broader narratives in private photo albums. These narratives follow a basic, mostly chronological storyline of a person's journey into war, the preparation to leave, the travel to the war theater, followed by deployment and some variation of an end, with until the German attack on the Soviet Union was marked by swift victories. Three factors shape this basic story. First, traditional depictions of tourist travel, such as familiar vacation scenes in private albums. Second, equally traditional yet less personal war images, including those publicized in print media. And third, Nazi propaganda, its visual and literary library. These influences are on display in German album pages devoted to the campaigns against Poland in the West and in the Balkans. They also feature prominently in early depictions of the war against the Soviet Union. Many of these early images of Operation Barbarossa seem like extensions of the prior success story. Their shared title could be Germany is Conquering the Soviet East, and I, the album author, am part of this historic event. We see the author's eastward advance in the summer of 1941, the encounter with locals and the landscape, often with ironic derisions in the captions, such as the one you saw, Soviet blessings, borrowed from Nazi propaganda. Unsurprisingly, combat is most frequently captured ex post by way of dead or captured enemy soldiers, destroyed machinery, or other structures that served as backdrops to trophy photographs. More so than individual images, album renditions of the East reflect prevailing expectations and biases. They do so mostly in the captions, thus inscribing a specific Nazi-affine interpretation of the photographs. The Eastern landscape is described as vast or endless. The people are reduced to ethnic types, including Russians, Roma, Jews, and Asians, and their way of life is alleged to be backward, primitive, or dirty. All these are familiar tropes associated with Western cultural domination, reinforced by Nazism's racialized worldview and wartime propaganda. We can find elements of that in German depictions of other parts of Europe too, but there they are more limited to specific groups such as Black soldiers in the French or British armies. Clearly, with the start of the war against the Soviet Union, these stereotypical inscriptions gain in intensity. By making military conquest look like an exciting, though arduous, but rewarding version of tourism, Germans in the East combined a standard narrational trope of family albums with documenting their participation in a collective endeavor that was meant to end happily, from their perspective, in the Wehrmacht's victory and the author's homecoming, as it did in albums devoted to previous campaigns. But after the start of Operation Barbarossa, triumphalism was brief. To be sure, there is no scarcity of photos showing streets lined with destroyed Red Army hardware, long convoys of Soviet prisoners of war being led into captivity, or jubilant locals greeting advancing German soldiers with flowers. There are also seemingly innocent photos of settings we know as Holocaust sites. One of the albums by a German Red Cross nurse who came to Kiev in late 1942 contains the page you see on this slide. The photo on the upper right looks like Babi Yar, where tens of thousands of Jews had been murdered more than a year earlier. Whether this photo indeed shows the killing site or another ravine close to Kiev, and whether the nurse knew about the mass murder of Jews in Kiev is unclear from the album, and no additional context information is available to answer these questions. But the longer the war against the Soviet Union went on, the greater the distance, physically as well as mentally, to the home front, and the fiercer the conditions became. What stood in the way of German victory, according to the albums, was not so much the Red Army, which remains pretty elusive, as the enemy on the other side of the front line. Instead, it is the East, with its vastness and climate, that seems to swallow the invading and occupying force. Starting in the fall of 1941, images of advancing German troops and transports tend to thin out, and what we see are smaller groups no longer rapidly on the move, but stationed over extended periods of time in one place. Views and vistas changed over time as well as throughout albums. As the newness and exoticism of the occupied space wore off, initially exciting motifs became familiar and repetitive. Thus, fewer photographs were taken and added to an album. Contextual sources such as letters and diaries offer clues. In this desolate landscape, there isn't really all that much to photograph, wrote Kurt Schneider, a private in an infantry division deployed in the northern front sector in December 1941 in a letter to his parents. But like other soldiers, he kept taking pictures and was adamant his family in Germany would see them. After he was killed in action in March 1942, it was his sister who later compiled his photos into a memorial album that she donated to the German Federal Military Archive, one of the largest repositories of World War II imagery.
Yes.
In this and in other albums, the failure of the anti-Soviet blitzkrieg in late 1941 seems caused by the elements, with the Wehrmacht finding itself stuck, first in the autumn mud, then in the deep snow. There is an abundance of caption references to the record minus temperatures and of photography depicting the transformed winter landscape, as well as Germans bundled up in layers of clothing that often covered their uniform insignia and made them look like locals. The longer Germans were stationed in the east and the further the anticipated victory retreated beyond the horizon, the more they started to see and show the specific behind the propaganda cliché. Now, that does not mean German albums offer more than indirect or superficial glimpses at the many, often deadly challenges faced by civilians or POWs living under German rule. But towards the end of 1941, more neutral, more precise captions start to replace earlier Nazi-infused stereotypes, indicating prefabricated slogans were losing power to be replaced by personal experiences. As a result, we still find biased but more attentive depictions of locals who, if they were perceived as willing collaborators, on occasion share space with Germans on an album page. So we are coming to the end of the story. What may have started as a project designed to produce an album of personal and collective triumph evolved, in the case of the war in the East, into a disintegrated narrative before it petered out altogether, leaving blank pages in an unfinished album. Operation Barbarossa began in the early morning of June 22nd, 1941, but for the Germans involved, its temporal arc and spatial contours vanished over time. The war thus resisted clear-cut sense-making well before it culminated in unconditional surrender. German image collections of military achievements and symbols of national appreciation, such as medals and other decorations, had lost their meaning beyond personal memory. Albums thus either end abruptly or shift radically from a wartime to a post-war narrative. At times, hindsight allowed for creating a personal conclusion by including maps, often hand-drawn, of the routes traveled, sometimes with the addition of dates of military service or time spent in an Allied POW camp. Despite the album story's fragmentation, they retained an emotional core that was to gain importance over time. The strongest, and I would argue most important, album representations of German presence in the East and of the bias inherent in this representation are photos of German dead and war graves. This brings me in conclusion and very briefly to my second aspect, albums and historic memory. Private photo albums were family projects in that the spouse, the children, and other relatives of a person deployed during the war contributed to their production or participated in their usage and signification. This becomes most obvious when an album, such as the one by this German Red Cross nurse, was continued by relatives after the original author's death. The experience of personal damage permeates German albums of the war in the East, first as images of fallen comrades and other members of the author's primary reference group, but over time increasingly as a crucial testament to the scale of collective loss. Harald Welzer and others have argued that German transgenerational memory about the Nazi era is much less formed by knowledge conveyed in history lessons or during visits to memorial sites. Instead, they stress the emotional effects of family discourse within which the Holocaust occupies a marginal space. Private photo albums were key raw material for memory formation within German families and, by extension, German society as a whole. They are fluent in their signification. To this day and into the future, even among readers with scant or no personal connection to Germany's war in the East, they will prompt images and ideas, trigger memories and associations, thoughts and emotions against the background of violent imagery we are exposed to every day. Yet these albums are still sadly under-researched as a source for German meaning production and World War II remembrance. Images of loss, suffering, and death focus on the German experience and play a prominent role in these albums. They construct and convey a strong message of German victimhood well before the end of the war. They are thus a foundational element on which the enduring post-war German narrative of self-victimization and denial of responsibility for Nazi-era crimes was built. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. What a fascinating topic, and I see that the audience is already warming up. Please continue typing your questions in the chat if you have any. Now that we're turning to our second speaker, Professor Wendy Lauer. Wendy Lauer is the John K. Roth Chair and George R. Roberts Fellow at Claremont McKenna College in Claremont, California. She's also the director of the McRubian Center for Human Rights at that same institution, Claremont. Wendy also served as the interim director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the USHMM. Wendy's research has impacted and covered many areas of Holocaust research and many outstanding publications. Allow me to single out only 4. Her first monograph was Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in the Ukraine, 2005, which stems from her PhD at American University and which won the 2007 award from Choice. The Shoah in Ukraine, History, Testimony, Memorization, 2008, was co-edited with Ray Brandon. I've been grateful reference on Ukraine. A 2013 book,
Wait, Jan, there is a problem with your audio.
Oh. Oh. No, I think mine is fine. I see somebody else talking. Is it fine now?
Okay, continue, sorry.
So the edited a book on Ukraine. I've been grateful just this past week for this essential reference on Ukraine. Her 2013 book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, was translated into 21 languages and was a finalist for the 2013 National Book Award in the nonfiction category and the National Jewish. Most recently, she has published The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed, an insightful and honestly beautiful written account of one specific Holocaust photography. A personal note as well, Wendy is a trusted mentor of mine. So in my name and all those of the organizing team, Wendy, we're delighted to have you with us today, and the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jan, for that really generous introduction. I just excited about our discussion. I was taking a lot of notes from Jürgen, and I do feel like we're among so many friends here, and it's going to be a really wonderful conversation. And Western Galilee, thank you for organizing this and for all the program that you're doing and that you continue to do during COVID and keep us informed and connected on this important research. So I'm going to get right into my presentation, and I'm going to set my my alarm here, so that I don't go over. I try not to go over. I want to focus on, if you've had a chance to look at the Ravine, there are a lot of different themes in there about how we conduct research and the pitfalls and the advantages of it. But today I want to focus on one theme having to do with photography, and that is resistance, and also bring the current work from the Ravine on the case study of the photographer into my presentation, but start a little bit more broadly. Where do we look for resistance as a history? Have we paid enough attention to the material culture in the form of the photograph? Think about the basic contours of the atrocity photography debate, which was largely set off by images beginning with the Spanish Civil War, actually going back to the American Civil War, and then the expansion of the material from the Second World War and post-war era. The debate centered on the viewer and consumer, and less so on the actual image as it was produced and utilized at the time of the atrocities to document them and suppress them. And resistance is a theme, I would argue, that's interwoven in all of this, in this atrocity photography. The perps knew that the photos could be used in the resistance and therefore sought to suppress them, so much so that an SS officer could be punished for taking these kinds of photos of murder, but not punished for the murder itself, as we see in the Taubner case. Ordinary witnesses and victims took the photos as evidence of what happened to stoke resistance at the time through the Polish underground and other networks, including official newspapers and propaganda campaigns of the Allies. After the war, they were key to starting trials and the pursuit of justice. Formerly in the IMT, where images such as the Liepaja massacres were first shown and delivered by a Jewish resistance fighter who was a laborer in the Liepaja Gestapo headquarters. And informally, when survivors presented atrocity images, whether taken by perps or ordinary witnesses who sought justice to inform the world of the horror, the images themselves contain that potential because they were images of murder, including mass murder. They were repugnant. And as Lynn Hunt in her work on human rights and Sharon Slavinsky in her work, Human Rights on Camera, and others have elucidated, that very specific content of the crime elicited a response to support or resist. And for those who wanted to resist in some way, photography was surely one. My presentation will stress the historical agency of the photograph during and after the Holocaust. Since Susan Sontag's provocative, indignant book on photography was published, the debate over the ethics of the photographer has given way to nuanced theories drawing from Walter Benjamin, Roland Barthes, and continue with more recent studies by Didi Huberman, among others. Actually a lot of work obviously has been done in this field, and there's a new book on the Liepaja, the Epstein family photographs, Barbie Zelitzer's work, Janina Struck, Carol Zemmel. So I'm not the first to look at this. I'm just trying to tease out different elements of it and argue for more research on these photographs. The many facets of the image as a cultural aesthetic object, historical evidence, as an act of bearing witness, as a memory, an artifact of trauma, as an icon or anomaly have been illuminated. But we are returning now to Sybil Milton's 1980s argument that we must appreciate and study Holocaust photographs as core historical sources to be researched like written documents, not merely as marginal illustrations selected in the final stage of a book's production, which the gentleman who introduced us mentioned. Marianne Hirsch's work also stresses the agency of the photograph, but in the personal, most affective experience of memory shared among Holocaust survivors and victims and transmitted to their descendants. As certain photographs of the Holocaust have become iconic representations that lose their grounding in the past, scholars have warned against the temptation to overinterpret images, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Boy with his arms raised. Some critics have pointed out the importance of understanding Holocaust photography as a genre clustered around certain periods, such as liberation, or forms, such as the album. Now, Eisenhower, after the war, had ordered, at the closing days of the war, had ordered that visual evidence be collected to guard against forgetting and disbelief. The photograph was invoked as the force for remembering and believing. In Barbie Zelitzer's volume, Visual Culture and the Holocaust, she describes liberation photos taken by journalists and US soldiers as raw representations of Nazi evil. You see the corpses and the gaunt figures. Pictorial reporters, as they were called in the 1940s, not photojournalists, compiled montages without text. No historical information and captioning seemed necessary, producing a visual salvo of headlines from the front rather than an explanation or story. Headlines were blunt. This is Nazi evil, for example. This is the collapse of civilization. These pictures don't lie. This is in Stars and Stripes. We're holding up the mirror to the Huns. David Schneer's work on Jewish photographers in the Red Army goes beyond the reportage and evidentiary forms of the photograph to a deeper analysis of the image as a form of testimony, arguing that rather than viewing photographs as uncontested bearers of truth, we must conceptualize them as he says, quote, witnesses that give testimony under interrogation and help make people believe. Like written testimony, photographs bear witness to events as a direct experience. They are authored by the photographer, who decides what his thesis will be, his focal point, his subjects, and how the images will be composed and cropped. However, this form is unlike that created by a witness, whose statements are circumscribed by the limits of memory recall, language, knowledge acquired about the event after the fact, and other cognitive psychosociological influences. As the photograph is studied over time, the scholar discovers things captured in the image that the photographer did not see when he or she took the picture. Here are some images, rather iconic images that I think this one obviously in the middle is classic as far as resistance, but one could look at each one of these images, even though they seemingly don't show resistance, and interrogate those photographs as with the question of resistance. To what extent are these images engaged in the history of resistance, rather because in the hands of resistance fighters, they foment that action, or they're brought into the courtroom, or the individual pictured in them was engaged in resistance, writing a diary and hiding perhaps. And of course, a lot of this has to do with how we define resistance, how broadly we define resistance. And I should mention, even though this is a talk on the Holocaust in photography, that these are disturbing images, and I know all of you are aware of this, but I did want to provide that kind of forewarning, because I'm going to show another image in a minute that's up close. The photographic documentation of the Holocaust is especially rich because the events coincided with the mass production and consumption of the small handheld camera. No longer confined to an indoor studio and prearranged sittings, photography became a widespread cultural and social practice, a new means of mass communication that ushered in the visual age of today. And unlike the stationary tripod cameras that required 5 to 20-second exposures for each photograph and patient subjects who had to pose motionless, the new portable cameras captured people in action. The Leica was patented in 1925, the Zeiss Icon introduced in 1933, and across Europe, Jews developed this craft and trade as commercial photography, and particularly in conjunction with their mass immigration. They also brought, it was the spread of this technique and of this expertise actually accompanied the emigration of Jews who were involved in this very much in Eastern Europe. Hobby photography was popular and photojournalism was coming into its own as a profession. Here are just some images. Actually, I think Petra Bopp is on this call. Long ago in Germany, she was involved in an exhibit that really changed my thinking and was in some ways the kernel, one of the impetuses for my work in the Ravine. And she did worked on a exhibit of German photo albums and photography during the Second World War. And these were some of the things that she found. And I actually looked into myself as well, which are the advertisements in German military magazines promoting the use of the camera, the optical Panzer, was promoting how durable the camera is, and that there was very much in the German idea of being a part of this monumental history and actually documenting it for posterity. So there was ordinary Germans, ordinary people were encouraged to take photos. Here, this film company Agfa is saying photos are a bridge between the home front and the battlefront. So this proliferation of the camera, 10% of the German population owned cameras by 1939. Joseph Goebbels embedded 15,000 photojournalists, producing more than 3.5 million images. So the Second World War was not only the most destructive, it was also the most photographed. When the mass killing began in the summer of 1941, Nazi leaders feared the explosive potential of these photographic images in counter-propaganda and in stoking resistance. The head of the 6th Army stationed near Mariupol in Zhytomyr implored soldiers not to take pictures of the mass murder occurring there in August 41. Similar bans were issued at least 5 times in September and December 41, April 42, again in June and July 1944. Heinrich Himmler deployed his SS agents to confiscate negatives and prints, but the repeated issuing of the ban reveals that Nazi leaders could not control the photographing of atrocities. It was an order that was not followed. In fact, as I mentioned before, the one time that Hitler, as I'm aware of, correct me if you know another case, that Himmler put one of his SS officers on trial for killing Jews was in a Munich court in 1943 against a Waffen-SS commander. And in the verdict, it stated, quote, that the commander shall not be punished because of the actions against the Jews as such. The Jews have to be exterminated, and none of the Jews that were killed is any great loss, unquote. Rather, this lieutenant Taubner was guilty of excessive barbarism unworthy of a man in a uniform, including, quote, taking tasteless and shameless pictures and openly bragging about them to his wife and friends back in Germany. Patriotism, anti-Semitism, lurid fascination with the inhumanity, moral outrage at witnessing genocide, myriad other motives caused ordinary soldiers to document the spectacles of violence inflicted on Jews, captured Soviet POWs, partisans, forced laborers, and so-called Slavic Untermenschen. Yet the final act of killing, an event shared tragically by all the victims, all the non-survivors, is rarely portrayed as we have seen. Nazi leaders suppress these images as an official secret, confiscating the most incriminating of them while employing euphemisms such as special treatment to allude to the brutal truth. Now, when I started to work on this one photograph that is the subject of my book, and this was taken in Mariupol, Ukraine on October 13th, 1941. And as I would later learn, it was part of a series. And when it came to my attention in 2009 at the Holocaust Museum, the people it brought to my attention had other documentation, which was necessary for the research, including testimony from the photographer. So I could identify the photographer, Lubomir Skrovina, who was a Slovak security guard, that it was taken in Ukraine. And I had the date October 13th, 1941, and could start to research the pieces of this photograph, including the uniforms of the Germans, and go back to the actual site and try to corroborate and place the photograph in its proper context. I assume that the photographer of the atrocity in Mariupol must have been a collaborator standing at close range in military uniform, helping to prevent the Jewish family from fleeing and humiliating them with his camera. In fact, I learned that already in May 1943 in Bratislava, the photographer was denounced for, quote, making photos that were not permitted and working against the new order in Europe. It was on this occasion that the photographer's name first appeared in the wartime record, and that the Mariupol photo became the subject of an inquiry. Skrovina was born in 1916. He was a radio shop owner in Banska Bystrica, and was summoned in 1943 by Slovakia's state security headquarters in Bratislava and interrogated by a Secret Service officer handling cases of Jews in hiding and of illegal immigration. Here are some photos of Lubomir actually during the war in the center. This photograph was taken in September 1941 in Mariupol, Ukraine, where he took the atrocity photograph, the one that I just showed you, and he is there with his comrades. He's sitting in the middle with the glasses, and there he is to the right, also with his, you can recognize him, the same gentleman. And there, this is his wedding photo. He married a Czech woman. He was Slovakian, and that was actually considered rather courageous or risky because of the position of the Slovaks, the anti-Czech sentiment of the Slovaks at this time. So even in his choice of marriage was already revealing that he wasn't 100% much of a loyalist as far as the Tiso regime. Skrovina's profile, as documented in the course of the investigation, was curious. At the end of 1941, he had been discharged from the Slovakian army for health reasons after having served on the Eastern Front in the security division in Ukraine as both a guard and company scribe. The Slovaks were allied to the Germans, and like the Romanians, Hungarians, Italians, Spaniards, and Finns, participated in Operation Barbarossa in the summer of 41. In Slovakia, all males aged 16 to 60 were required to serve either in the military or as a member of the radical fascist group, the Hlinka Guards. When Skrovina returned from his duties on the Eastern Front, he brought photographic film, and in his home, he established a dark room where he developed prints of his former comrades in arms and of massacres of Jewish civilians. Yet Skrovina was also confronted by this Secret Service officer with what was engaging in monkey business. This was someone who had denounced him who worked in his radio shop and who also was part of his unit in the East and had also witnessed these mass crimes in Mariupol. In his response, Skrovina stated, quote, "While I was in the military, as I stated above, I took part in the field campaign on the Eastern Front as a corporal. In Ukraine, I had the opportunity to see the atrocity of the war when Ukrainian militia and German finance guards used guns against partisans. Some of the partisans were shot because they resisted. I took pictures of it. After I arrived back home, I didn't show these pictures to anyone, and later on I burned them as I didn't want them to end up in the wrong hands. These pictures were taken publicly with the approval of the German commanders." Now, during the war, Skrovina was allowed to return home for the Christmas holiday in December 41. So after he had taken these pictures in 41, I learned from the letters that he wrote to his wife simultaneously to taking the photos, that he was completely fed up with the war, that he was becoming sick and disgusted by it. And he was engaged with his wife, not only the taking of these photos, but and sending the negatives back to her. She was developing them back in their hometown of Banska Bystrica. She was assisting him with this, and he was informing her to keep this under wraps. And he was together, they were basically agreeing to do more, to actually find ways to resist. So he did not continue on with his unit. And when he went back for the Christmas holiday at the end of 41, he feigned illness and he joined the resistance. Slovak President Father Tiso soon complied at this time with German pressure to deport thousands of Jews to Nazi-occupied Poland. The first Jewish deportees to arrive at Auschwitz were young Slovakian women, like Helen Tischauer, in March 1942. Jews considered more valuable to Slovak society, such as male doctors, received a yellow slip, a dispensation that only Tiso could grant, sparing them temporarily from the deportations. Skrovina knew that deportation to the east meant death. He sheltered Jews in his home and helped some escape to the forest, including 2 doctors who had these yellow slips. One of them was Skrovina's neighbor, Dr. Ladislav Gotthilf, an obstetrician gynecologist, and his wife, the doctor's wife, and their 5-year-old son. When Skrovina's wife became pregnant, Dr. Gotthilf cared for her, and in October 42, delivered their son, Lubomir Jr., into the crossfires of Nazism and Stalinism. Sometime in 1943, or the first half of 44, Gotthilf joined the medical corps of the Slovak resistance movement and camped in the mountains and forests around Skrovina's home. And Dr. Gotthilf brought his wife and his son with him. Slovakia stood in the maelstrom of the struggle over Eastern Europe as Hitler sought to retain the client state. Stalin aimed to extend Soviet communism across Eastern Europe, and the Western Allies supported the restoration of the nascent democratic Czechoslovakia under statesman Edward Benes in exile in London. Our photographer, Lubomir, was among the thousands of Slovaks on the ground who participated in the Slovak national uprising between August and October 1944. In Skrovina's hometown of Banska Bystrica, the center of the resistance, the Slovak National Council. Here's some maps of the Eastern Europe in general. I can show you here, Reichskommissariat Ukraine, Mariupol is basically at the center here, and Banska Bystrica is down here. The Slovak National Council declared its will to restore the free state of Czechoslovakia, yet lack of coordination of these diverse forces, as well as the Soviet diversion of its promised support to Poland and Hungary, resulted in a tragic defeat. Himmler's Waffen-SS and mobile killing units descended on the region in a combined force that amounted to 48,000 soldiers, and a campaign of terror and reprisals ensued, targeting the partisans in the mountains and forests around Banska Bystrica. Hundreds of villages were razed, civilians and partisans were killed, and among them was the Gotthilf family. On November 10th, 1944, they seized Ladislav Gotthilf, his wife Eveline, and their 7-year-old son Mikel, who were taken to an anti-tank ditch at the edge of the road, shot, and dumped in a mass grave. Before Skrovina died 60 years later, he survived the war. During this period of wild retribution, he went into hiding until things settled down. He had been interrogated, as I said, in 43, and he was also questioned again in 1958 and again in the early 60s. And this is how the actual photograph, the atrocity photograph, came to light, because those post-war interrogations, those photographs were confiscated. What was the KGB-like authority in the restored Soviet Czechoslovakia seized them, actually stormed into his house and confiscated them. And during the interrogations, Skrovina also mentioned, I wanted to point out that during the Slovak national uprising, he did try to bring the photographs to the Americans and spoke to the authorities about them and wanted those to get to the Czech government in exile. So again, it's another kind of facet of how these photographs, the agency of the photographs and the role that they played, the central role that they played in the resistance in this in Slovakia and in general, to think about the role of photographs in the underground and in the resistance. So at the end of his life, 60 years later, in October 2005, Skrovina continued to be haunted by these photographs and continued to want them to be part of kind of getting the truth out to the world, educating the world, and also showing the world things in that photograph that perhaps were not appearing in the literature. In 1994, in post-Soviet independent Slovakia, he wrote a letter to the Minister of the Interior to request the return of his photographs and the negatives of, quote, Jewish civilians executed in Ukraine. This time when he wrote to the Minister of the Interior, he presented a motive for taking the photos. He said that he wanted to document the Ukrainians who were killing in the photos. He understood that this image uniquely showed their direct role. Indeed, this was a feature of Skrovina's visual documentation that immediately caught my attention. Jewish survivors had described Ukrainian collaborators as the worst, often referring to their brutal excesses as guards at gassing centers, yet there was very little in the German wartime documents to indicate that Ukrainians were formed into shooting squads and killing shoulder to shoulder, as we see in that photograph, since officially non-Germans were not supposed to be armed with guns. There's another step that Skrovina took towards the end of his life, and he died, as I mentioned, in 2005. In July 1997, he donated the camera he had used to take the Mariupol photographs to the then newly established Museum of the History of Jews in Bratislava. In the donation acknowledgement letter, the museum director stated that the camera would be displayed in a future exhibit on the Holocaust. At the time of his donation, Skrovina urged the museum director to find his photographs and negatives in the Czech archives. 66 negatives that he took, including additional atrocity photographs from Ukraine, have still not been found. Skrovina's photographs captured what he could not put into words. Now I'm wrapping up. In Susan Sontag's On Photography, she writes about photographers as conflicted moral agents, operating with mixed motives concerning conscience, taste, and the need to document reality. Skrovina's picture taking may have helped him make sense of the disorienting reality before his eyes, or may perhaps have shielded him by allowing him to turn his gaze from the atrocity itself to the lens, since photographing is essentially, as Sontag states, an act of non-intervention. But this characterization of the atrocity photographer as a passive witness or non-intervener is really not entirely in line with what we have uncovered about Skrovina. For him, photographing the event and trying to capture the entire scene, as he put it, was both an expression of defiance and a turning point. Sontag also argues that the photograph is a material vestige of his subject, a source for remembering and a stimulus for re-experiencing the event and people in the image. For Skrovina, 25 years old in 1941, the photographs captured this turning point. He was haunted by what he saw, heard, smelled, and felt. And as he wrote to his wife, he felt as if the blackness of his hair was seeping into his brain and turning his hair gray. There was nothing he could do, or so it seemed, to save those victims at that scene in October 41. But being there certainly shaped his subsequent choices and the risks he undertook, affecting himself and his family. He refused to stay on the front. He pretended to be sick. He spent months in a nerve clinic. Then he resumed contact with the Jews in his town, including sheltering some in the attic of his family home. He helped Dr. Gotthilf secure a place in the forest, although Skrovina ultimately could not save him, his wife, and child. Skrovina was an anti-fascist and an anti-Soviet. He felt no pride wearing any government-issued uniform, and he hated the war. The Mariupol image became his testimony against the fascists, the war, and the mass murder of innocent women and children. It was, as he wrote to his wife at that time, good material for the resistance that was to be handled carefully but with resolve. In the history of the Holocaust, no government, no non-Jewish organization, no church openly and consistently launched a campaign against the Nazi genocide of European Jews. The most successful effort occurred at the national level in Denmark, where King Christian X retained his authority and with popular support protected Danish Jews from persecution and deportation, saving more than 7,200 Danish Jews who were ferried to Sweden. On the Aryan side of the Warsaw Ghetto, a branch of the Polish underground supported by the Polish government in exile issued appeals to provide relief to Polish Jews as they were being deported and annihilated. Resistance, we have learned in this case, was enacted in piecemeal, indignant acts and also in collective uprisings. Rescue and relief efforts were undertaken quietly, often heroically. In rare cases, the sheltering and caring extended for months and years during the war. Often rescue came in the form of temporary shelter with conditions attached. In all of these forms, rescue and relief were risky. A German could refuse to carry out an order to murder Jews, but a German or non-German who was found guilty of sheltering Jews was defying a government policy and severely punished. Most striking is that rescue started with individuals. It usually did not grow beyond intimate groups, families, and communities that forged bonds of trust and secrecy. The Holocaust was for Skrovina the worst event that he could capture on film to communicate just how criminal and terrible the war was. But he and others whose outrage turned to documentation and resistance were swimming in an ocean of censorship and hostility. Resistance to history's most extreme case of genocide did not amount to more than the struggles of individuals such as Skrovina. As an eminent Auschwitz survivor observed, these efforts, no matter how brave or clever, were like throwing sand in the machinery of death. The resistors and rescuers deserve to be honored, but this should not detract from the disturbing reality that they acted alone because non-democratic states and non-governmental organizations failed them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. What a powerful and really insightful conclusion. I think that's going to launch a series of questions as well. For now, I'm turning over to Roni of the organizing team for the Q&A part.
Thank you, Jan. And I would like to also thank our speakers today. It was fascinating. And I would like to invite people from the audience to write their questions in the chat, and I will introduce at least some of them. And I will start with a question to Jürgen. Very few Nazi private albums or Nazi pictures depicting violence against the Jews in Western occupied Europe were found. There are nearly no pictures on the roundup of Jews in Italy, very few in France, but we do have quite a lot for Germany and Holland. Instead, there are thousands and thousands of photos taken in Eastern Europe. What could be the reason to explain this difference?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that one obvious answer is that the East, so to say, and I leave this deliberately opaque in its concrete meaning, the East is the locus of the Holocaust. This is where the violence takes place by way of executions, camps, and so on. What you see and what is documented from Western Europe and other sites outside of the East are the preparatory measures. Usually, of course, there are exceptions, and scenes in Italy after September 43 or in Hungary in 1944 would look, I think, similarly dramatic on occasion. But I think clearly the obvious reason is that Eastern Europe, particularly with the beginning of the war against the Soviet Union and the simultaneous start of organized mass killing, is the place where these scenes were much more frequently, and thus the chances for anyone taking photographs, and particularly the privileged Germans, exclusively because everyone else was banned from taking photos, and cameras were often requisitioned. That is I think what explains this. But then again, I mean, we know the extent of the killings compared to what we find in the albums. The results are rather sparse. Why is that? Why is it not integrated into these private albums? It looks a little different in so-called official albums, where police units or other Wehrmacht units try to provide a pictorial addendum to a war diary. There you tend to see more graphic expressions of German anti-Jewish violence. But this is not what I'm focusing on, because I wanted to look at the stuff that makes it into the families, and thus might form the background for family discourse and shape German perceptions of World War II. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. Another question by Edward Westerman. In the case of atrocity photographs, we see that many of these are carried on the bodies of the perpetrators. How might we explain this, and what insight might this offer us about the perpetrators?
Yeah, thanks, Ed, for that question. I have the wonderful support of a focus group. Ed and Petra Bob and others are part of this, and we have been talking about the stuff that we share. And this is one of the questions that we have discussed. I think there are some speculations. We can't know for sure. To me, it looks like this is material that individual soldiers mostly would want to keep close to themselves. It might have a little bit the same emotional value as pornography. Stuff you want to keep to yourself, you want to share, if you share it at all, with select people. It's not for display in a medium like an album that is a display medium. Or if you do so, I think you want to reserve that album to special people. So that would be my speculation. To restrict the scope of audience, I think would be the most convincing one. And share it on a very impromptu and spontaneous basis, as you can when you have it in your uniform pocket and run into someone whom you want to share it to. You don't have to dig out an album or a bunch of other collected photographs.
Yeah, I would just add too that those atrocity photographs are, again, the most incriminating. They are distinctively different. And that's why they get removed after the war. And so the thinking as far as the taking of them, the possession of them, the circulation of them is very different from that trajectory, I would argue, than say, comrade photo, and maybe you have a personal photograph of your loved one, right, that is intimate to you. It could even be, your fiance, nude or something. I mean, it could be something that personal or that you keep close to you. So there's the secretiveness of a photograph is different. There are different reasons for it, but these atrocity ones have that same kind of secretiveness potentially, but then they are also part of the resistance. So then they come out into full view and then become published, and they are reproduced, right? And they keep cropping up, among the resistance groups you see, or even the survivors at the USC Shoah Foundation. When I analyzed those testimonies and looked for testimonies where survivors hold up photographs, obviously at the end they hold up family ones. That was part of how they were, that was elicited from them during the interview process. But they often just volunteered, to show these atrocity photographs and kind of put them in the camera during the interview, like, look at this, this is what happened, don't turn away. And often it's the same photograph. It's a famous picture of a hanging in Poland. And so these were kind of reproduced, and maybe, in the liberation camps, or because they interact with the community, survivor communities with one another, like that they had these, and it was like their truth of the pure horror of what may have happened to one of their loved ones, of the murder. And they would kind of selectively put it out there as a warning, or, as a moment of truth. So they're just, the atrocity photos, I think, do contain their own kind of distinctive history as far as their reproduction, their dissemination, their publication, and how they're handled in informal settings, the courtroom, in front of the camera, and also, within survivor groups.
Thank you, Wendy. I will present, I think, 2 questions for each of you because we have limited time. So to Jürgen, following up on Edward's question, are there any differences in pictures made by regular soldiers, members of the police battalions, and say members of the Eisengruppen, most directly involved in murder of Jews? And to Wendy, were the perpetrators of the Mikel massacre aware that they are being pictured by Skobina and what was their reaction? And the second question by Javi to Jürgen, apparently some of the features you mentioned also exist on Neumann's album. Can his pictures be analyzed in a similar way? And to Wendy, how does or does not appear the violence that Jürgen mentioned in the pictures you studied? So Jürgen, do you want to start?
Sure. So differences between different German units, if you like, police, Wehrmacht, and so on. I showed you also a couple of album pages from a German Red Cross nurse. The narrative tends to be similar because, as I described, it's a story that starts with being deployed, getting there, and then being there, with some version of an end often. So that is the stable core. And I don't think there's all that much deviation, depending on, of course, there's preference as to taste and composition. And that varies vastly in terms of what people like to show primarily. Some are very, very heavy on landscape. Some are very artistic. Others are very crude and very minimal also in the description. Captions aren't always there. So there is this is where this the variation really comes in between albums that have some things in common. In terms of unit differences, I wouldn't say there is much when it comes to private albums. Really, the biggest difference is with regard to albums that can be perceived or are clearly labeled as official, as unit albums. There and here you have a much greater likelihood of police or SS units depicting anti-Jewish violence, because that's what they did to the largest extent. For Wehrmacht units, of course, you find that too, but I think it would be more integrated into a fighting narrative, where you have the military confrontation per se in the foreground, while police and SD SS have a broader portfolio that deals with fighting, but fighting the partisan, fighting the rear enemy. So I think that is the biggest difference. I'm not sure I got Javi's question right. Could you repeat that, Roni? Or Javi asked directly?
Javi, do you wanna maybe?
Thank you for both of you. I was just thinking as you presented those different albums about the album of Neumann from Sobibor. And some of the aspects that you mentioned regarding the family, regarding the funerals, regarding other things appear there as well. And I wonder if you see that album as part of what you have just analyzed, or that's a total different story. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fascinating question. This is the Sobibor collection that the museum fairly recently acquired, and it includes 2 albums by the deputy commander of the Sobibor death camp. What you find there is nothing that shows any of the things that we are really interested in, to put it bluntly, which is the violence on site. Instead, you find the beautified version of everyday life by a German SS officer, very much like the one we have from Auschwitz, that depicts the outings in the vicinity of Auschwitz, and nothing what we would really want to have depicted. So there are similarities. I think there is a greater inclination clearly on the part of these officers to actively not show these aspects of violence that they are really involved in as a core business. There is more of an integration of violent scenes in those albums by the German officials of one kind or another that are not doing just anti-Jewish violence of that kind, because it creeps in. It's something that adds to the narrative of the story, that makes this look more exotic, appealing, interesting in one kind or another. So I think that to me would be the biggest analog as well as difference. But thanks for the question.
Thank you, Jürgen. Wendy?
Sure. So he did take those photographs openly. He was the company scribe, and he was told by his commander to go check it out when he heard the noise. They heard the gunfire and heard the screams. And he arrived there. It was not, the Slovaks were not brought in officially to be guards at that killing action. And so he was able to kind of circulate around with his camera because he was in uniform. And the German finance guards and the Ukrainian collaborators, the militia, you know, I don't have any testimony from them that talks about seeing a photographer or being photographed. So the Germans were interrogated after the war, and so were the Ukrainians. The photographs and photography were not part of those investigations. The photos were sitting in the Prague archive. They were locked up there since, you know, 58, and those other cases that they started up subsequent to that. So yeah, he was taking them openly. They, you know, didn't care that they were being photographed. The finance guards were not SS personnel. They were supposed to be at the train station checking packages and were recruited kind of on the spot. Ukrainians didn't care. Or maybe they thought it was great that just kind of affirmed what they were doing, that they could be photographed. But I can't speak to that. I don't have any documentation about the thinking of the killers as far as being photographed. And I don't know, again, Javi, your question about violence, the specific photo that I showed as violence that's a different form than what we see in the albums, or did Jürgen answer your question?
Well, my question was about what we don't see in the picture. And since your book is sitting near me, I know that it's a series of a few pictures. And I wonder, how do you understand the lack of photographing violence, which we all know that was part of those actions? So Jürgen referred to it from his albums, but your picture is a little bit different. So can you say something about that?
Well, the fact that, you know, the series that Lubomir ended up taking, so I showed you the one photograph, but again, you have to get into the very more technical history. A lot of the historiography on this has been really occupied by more ethical issues, aesthetic issues, how we respond to them, our concerns about how survivors might feel about them, the bizarre kind of juxtapositions that we see in albums, because we know Sobibor is Sobibor, and yet we see pretty trees being planted. Like, it's really all about us, instead of really looking at the real concrete empirical history of those photographs. And in fact, this photograph was taken with that camera I showed you. That is important because it then can help us understand how many photos can be taken with such a camera on the spot, based on the testimony. So it turns out he took a series of photographs. And so those aren't curated like an album. That's what he took on the spot. Click, 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 click. He could take, I think, up to 7 images. And we see on that day, he took them sequentially to testify to these series of events as they unfolded. So we see he took pictures of the Jews on the path to the mass murder site who were killed, who tried to resist. Speaking of resistance, he took, you know, pictures of other women and being shot at close range by the same killers, and they're in the book. And so it is more of a narrative of events in that way, and it's the narrative of mass murder. You know, as it unfolded, you know, at that moment, within those hours when he was at the scene, and that's the rawness of that, and the action, right? As I mentioned, the portable camera that you can document, he can move around and get different perspectives. So it's distinctive from what we see in an album for the many reasons that Jürgen beautifully explained. It's a more complex undertaking.
There's also a very simple difference that I might want to highlight here between individual photographs and an album. If you throw away photographs, there's usually no trace. If you tear a photograph out of an album, there might be a trace. There might even be a caption left. So this is where you get more clues as to what the original narrative might have looked like. But of course, with a kind of a leftover caption and an absent photo, what you get in the end is speculation. Unless, of course, you have additional documents to draw on, which in many cases are just not available.
Thank you so much for the both of you. It was really, really fascinating. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I want to give the floor to Dr. Boaz Cohen and apologize to all of the other participants that wrote questions and we didn't have time to address them. But thank you, and Boaz, the floor is yours. Mute.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, time to find the button. As always, it was an amazing event. We're really happy and thankful for having such distinguished scholars here whose material is so interesting. And I think, as Ofer said in the beginning, we are just in the beginning. We will see much more of such research coming on. And I'm thinking on how we do this also as teachers, how we use photographs in a less way, using these photographs in a way that they can really help our students understand the mechanics of Holocaust, of the Holocaust to its various facets. I use the Treblinka volume, a photo album, the good old days one, and it's a photo album from a concentration camp with no death. You only have recreation and animals and a running competition, which I found really prosperous. Like they really had a good life. And then when they tried to even to take the caption off, which they didn't succeed, etc. So I think this is, we are gaining more and more materials and understandings. And I think this is really important. And thank you for this work. I want to mention two things we are having soon. We are having another Holocaust and war and mass murder conference next month. This time 80 years to Babi Yar and the battle for Moscow. Again, we are trying to put together the military history of the time and the Holocaust history and bring them together. Some of you will speak there, I already know. And we have a very unique keynote speaker, Richard Overy will give the keynote lecture, which we are very thankful for him for agreeing to speak. And I think it's a really good feeling that we can do this on Zoom, bringing together people who will not come naturally to the same conferences, bringing together distinguished scholars who maybe will not come to your conference in Akko or somewhere else. So we really are finding this really thrilling. What we have more on our plate now is our innovation and entrepreneurship in Holocaust memory course, which is our second cohort. We did one course like this last year, academic year. We are doing one starting October. We had an amazing international team. Some of the people are sitting here from Austria and Italy and Britain and India and South Africa and Switzerland, the US, UK, really a strong team of people from BAs to postdocs, early careers, and some people also who are further on in life and wanted to join. We are teaching people to do startups with partners from the Israeli Smart City Association who specialize in startups and smartups too. And we are working on developing Holocaust memorial projects in international teams. It was an amazing experience, and we are starting on a course like this on the 18th of October is the first class. So if you have friends, students, colleagues who you think this is good for them, even for yourself. So I put the brochure here and it has a link in the PDF. I think this is really an amazing opportunity for the forthcoming generation of Holocaust scholars, teachers, and staff to learn the ways of doing a new innovative projects. And we'll really be happy if you help us get the word out. It turned out we'll send another 2,000 address mail tomorrow, but actually, in the end, it's someone who knows someone who is a student and etc. So thank you all very much. It was really, thank you for the organizing team. I already said that in the beginning, we couldn't have done all this amazing project without Roni, Daniela, Jan. In the case of recording, we have Yaron. Yaron is also leading our Holocaust history and military history team. So really amazing people doing amazing stuff, and we have an amazing audience. So thank you all very much, and be in touch. See you in Akko whenever that will be possible.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.